I want to make sure that we hit on some regulatory topics here because that's a big chunk of what we missed out on last time. So we're going to shift into some regulatory questions right now, recognizing that yes, we see the questions coming across regarding manufacturing and CMC. We're going to get back to that shortly, but we've got some regulatory questions as well. So I want to make sure we hit on the big ones. Roberta, I'd like to turn to you with this one. What are the key considerations regulatory bodies like FDA and EMA are looking at in terms of mRNA therapies, drug quality attributes, integrity, concentration, residual DNA template, and so on?
Yeah, so Akhilesh actually hit on a number of these in responses to the other questions, but I'll bring in maybe a layer a little bit higher. So just recognizing initially that FDA, EMA, and other agencies have gone through a Herculean effort to bring the first two mRNA vaccines to market. And there was a high level of focus, as one would expect, and really want to ensure a high level of focus on safety requirements for consistency of manufacturing, for that are critically important for us to have confidence in the technology and that it's safe for our communities. Now, the regulatory agencies are going to continue and have held a very high bar and level of rigor for mRNA-based vaccines, and we'll see that unfold in the therapeutic space. But just to kind of focus a little bit more on this space of innovation in general, regulators are going to sharpen their standards around quality attributes, around dose selection, around raw material inputs and excipients. They're going to challenge us to convince them of the robustness of our platform and demonstrating the robustness of the platform technology. And so, as we go through this process, we have experience in having in successfully gaining approval for vaccines for influenza that meet the efficacy, safety, tolerability, and effectiveness that are required by the FDA. And so we're going to continue to have to meet that bar. And with mRNA, we have a new understanding of what the agencies are looking for globally, who've since approved the current mRNA platforms, current mRNA COVID vaccines. So it's going to continue to be an evolving space, but I do want to recognize and acknowledge that regulatory agencies have done a Herculean phenomenal job, and they're going to continue to ensure that we meet or exceed previous standards. The bar is just going to continue to raise.
Yeah. Has Seqirus seen any challenges that you can share, or even anecdotes around? You said that the regulatory agency will continue to develop and express its expectations, but again, in any new modality or new platform technology, those expectations are sort of ever evolving. So I guess the question is, the newness of the technology, has it created any particular challenges for Seqirus in its regulatory dealings? Not necessarily bad experiences, but just challenging experiences, given that everyone's seeing some of this stuff for the first time.
The reality is that the regulatory agencies, FDA, EMA, et cetera, want to be in this discussion with us, and we're in an ongoing discussion with regulators around what are those attributes they're looking for, and what data we're bringing forward. Now, keep in mind, we're in preclinical with our current mRNA vaccine, but having been through this experience with all of our other products, Flucelvax, Fluad, Floria, go down the line, Audens, you name it, we've gone through this process with them. And so we understand the body of work that we need to be able to bring forward. And so the critical thing, I think, to take away from here is to lean in and work very closely with your regulators. And that's the critical important piece. It's the other thing to keep in mind is that mRNA vaccine technology is no longer brand spanking new, untried, untrue, right? It's been through the regulatory process. And to be quite frank, with emergency use authorization, real world evidence has been evolving in this space for mRNA vaccines even before they got full licensure. Generally, you get licensure and then you could begin assessing real world evidence. But there is a large body of data that is both in the world space and in the scientific space to get to licensure that has brought the confidence to regulators about this particular technology and platform. And so we're going to need to build on that. And in the case of flu, the regulatory path is already very clear. There is an accelerated path and a traditional path for approval, and we anticipate that those paths are going to continue to be effective when it comes to the mRNA vaccines related to influenza vaccine platforms.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Matt, if I can compliment
Oh.
to what Roberta was saying. We were talking about this before the show, right? Pandemic is March was 2020 was when pandemic was put us into a shutdown or national emergency. Since 3 years, mRNA LNP compositions have been in more people than biologicals, all the biologicals. So there is a lot more awareness about it. Now, the bigger challenge is, so awareness is a very good thing, but that was an emergency use authorization for vaccines. Now, when you're talking about where do you see the application for mRNA from therapeutics to other classes, cell therapy, gene therapy, that's where you will take some of the learnings and you will leverage, but also the questions that we were discussing, say, for example, on the immunogenicity. Those questions will be answered in a very different manner because the awareness for vaccine is in place. We also understand the consequence. So all the impact would be obvious when you have a different targeting, a different disease, a different focus area in those are the places when it will pop out. But awareness has substantially gone up.
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. And I was going to mention that when I asked for your feedback on that, Dr. Bhambhani, you've had plenty of experience with candidates that have gone, vaccine candidates, in fact, that have gone commercial. You mentioned in our pre-show banter, Gardasil. Just generally, what are your observations around what you're seeing on the regulatory front now? And you may have answered this to some degree, but I guess give us the big picture, what you're seeing on the regulatory front now compared to, perhaps what you saw back then, which may have been the last, the Gardasil may have been the last time that vaccines were, really in the mainstream news prior to your point, March of 2020.
Yeah, no, I think we recently got Pneumovax approved, but yeah, I think that the biggest changes, there have been a lot more, I would say, public opinions and scrutiny about those decisions given in the emergency use authorization, how it's viewed. But when it comes to a regulatory authority, um, a safety, the word safety is not taken for granted. The safety, efficacy, quality, or when I was talking about, you need to have a content uniformity, you need to know your product ID, you need to have potency and purity. Those things have never been compromised. The time frame in which those decisions were made may have been compressed, and therefore the amount of information that's available is less. What has changed from then to now, the pharmacovigilance that usually comes when you have the standard pathway versus when you have a compressed pathway, those data are coming out and they will continue to come out. So the pharmacovigilance portion is the key difference between your traditional approach to a vaccine approval versus a EUA, emergency use authorization approach. So that's,
Okay.
I think, is a highlight of emergency use.
Yeah. All right. Here's a real easy question from the audience, and I want to make sure you both have an opportunity to respond in case the answers are different from one company to the next. But IND or BLA? Akhilesh, since you're on my screen, maybe you can hit that one first. Is an IND? You're so the candidate that you're developing, your glycogen storage disease candidate, is that an IND or a BLA application?
No, this is a IND that was approved last year by FDA.
Okay.
BLA comes when you're close to a phase 3.
Yeah, it's a yes and a response. You need both. You need an IND to initiate your clinical work and to go into clinical trials. And that's required to demonstrate some level of safety using animal models. And then when you're applying for licensure, your formal application is a BLA.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the clarification. As I try to decipher audience questions, I see letters and words, I throw them out there. So I appreciate that.
you mind if I just carry on that piece of thread for just a moment?
Not
So
a bit.
Akhilesh talked about the regulatory pathway and the difference between the emergency use authorization and traditional approval. There is another click on that when it comes to influenza vaccines and other vaccines. Currently under influenza, there is an accelerated pathway and there's a traditional pathway. With COVID, that doesn't exist yet today, right? So in order to have an accelerated pathway, there needs to be some level of correlative protection. It's been defined that allows you to demonstrate that your vaccine is safe, efficacious, and able to move forward into the population while you then perform post-marketing requirements and commitments. In the case of influenza, an immunogenicity trial will get you approval on an accelerated pathway, and then you have to do a much larger multi-season efficacy trial in order to secure full licensure. So when you think about the regulatory pathway and how it needs to evolve in the COVID space, what we are looking for is that for those companies that are looking to bring a COVID vaccine to market, that correlative protection and accelerated pathway becomes really important. And so the agencies will be under pressure from the industry to say, what is this and how are we going to get there? And that may be a couple of years off. But just to kind of highlight for those that are in this journey, maybe in a smaller biotech or considering or in early stage of work, that's something to think about and to be discussing with regulators today. So as you lean in and you build those critical relationships with the FDA and EMA, these are some of the kind of questions you might want to bring forward as to when an accelerated pathway will become available and what does that look like and what's the correlative protection, because that will help you design your clinical trials in order to demonstrate that evidence to seek approval.
Beautiful. Perfect. Thank you. That's sound advice. And it's a good segue to my next question around, you mentioned FDA and EMA, and I'm curious what your experiences have been engaging regulatory bodies in different geographies, that is, around harmonization. Is everyone kind of paddling in the same direction, or is there still some dichotomy there that creates challenges for companies like Seqirus and Ultragenyx? So Roberta, since you're on my screen, I'll let you respond to that one.
Yeah, so harmonization has been the goal and every company would love to see this happen across our regulatory agencies globally. What we have seen in action during COVID is the communication and collaboration that has happened across agencies, FDA and EMA and others, engaging on a regular basis around what is the standard by which they're going to allow for emergency use authorization and approval of these new vaccines on a new platform. And so that's been demonstrated and we've heard about it. It's been almost an urban legend that's now come to bear. And it's proven to be really effective in this time when every day equals a life potentially lost in getting vaccines approved and through the process. So that is an important piece to keep in the back of your mind as you're engaging multiple agencies, to be very clear and understanding that they have the same goals. They may set different bars or different parameters for demonstration of safety, efficacy, immunogenicity, performance of your product, of your vaccine, of your medicine. So keep in mind that harmonization is key and there is a desire to be there. And we see some of this through advances that have happened over the last several years, our common technical dossier or documents. Those are now standard practice where we rewind the clock a few years back. We were still trying to work through this. A challenge we have to overcome is to ensure that the conversations we're having with our agencies are showcasing what we think are particularly important about the vaccine we're developing. And one other thing that's come out of this pandemic moment is that not only did we see the emergency use authorization come to bear, we've known it was available and it's been effective. EMA actually leverages a mock dossier, which is almost pathogen agnostic and allows for you to adopt an approach that's much faster, can go quicker in time from identification of your vaccine to approval to doses and arms. And again, every day saved equals lives saved. So more structure and guidance on how the emergency use authorization process works, more transparency and structure moving forward, on what data is required. Is it strain agnostic? All of that needs to be clarified, because as we continue in this vaccine space, especially in influenza and other pathogens of pandemic potential, it becomes really important that we understand how quickly we can go through it. So harmonization is one aspect. Another aspect is transparency and clarity in the pathways that exist today. And when it comes to therapeutics, of course, in the mRNA space, that pathway still needs to be tested and brought through with a new platform, a new modality in mRNA.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good segue to asking the same question of Dr. Bhambhani. What are you seeing out there in terms of coordination of regulatory efforts among different regulatory bodies?
I think Roberta handled or answered most of the things, but when it comes to relying on ECTDs for concurrent filing of BLAs and MAA in US and EU using centralized procedure, you can do those to gain efficiency and consistency. But global regulation, they're not one size fits all. There are differences in the approval process, even the fees, the formal pre-submission meetings, the scientific advice, how it's designated breakthrough versus prime. Um, all this allows enhanced interaction. For in EU, for example, you have to work with your national competent authorities in a member state. In contrast to CBER, EMA makes a recommendation, but approval comes from European Commission within 67 days of recommendation. So there are finite differences, but none of them is a showstopper. None of them is a showstopper and has never been.